Good afternoon, good evening, good night, whatever is most applicable to you guys. This is the development and analysis of human movement, skeletal considerations. So I tried doing a live stream, but it did not work. Blackboard Collaborate hated my browser, shut down everything. So this is my new attempt. So let's see how it goes. I get better production value out of this anyways, because I can use my green screen. Everything looks better. I'm alright. Anyways, here we go. So, the objectives today. I want you guys to gain a knowledge of the anatomy and bone and connective tissues. I gain some knowledge of the major joints and their associated movement. You're just going to learn a piece of it. You're going to gain some skill in identifying the major bones, muscles, and joints. You're going to gain some knowledge in the basic biomechanical principles of human movement. And you're going to gain a knowledge of the normal maturational changes from childhood to old age and their effects on the skeletal system. I shouldn't say skeletal muscle, I'm sorry. Lots of these are just touching on greater objectives for the course objectives, and just might get a little piece here, get a little piece in another lecture, so that by the end you will have all of them. Okay, so when we look at bone, we want to look at a structural analysis of that. So just as if you were building a house or a deck or a fence, right? You want to make sure that the structure that you're using can handle that the stresses and the strains that you're going to place upon that system. When it relates to bone, we're talking about typically tension and compression. That means we're talking about a pulling and a pushing that happens on a bone. Now when we write that in an equation, we're writing it as stress is represented as sigma, the little O right there, and it is force divided by area. Now force is measured in newtons, so we write that as newtons, and then the area is always measured as meters squared. So it's a newton meter square is the resultant force. Now we won't dive into that now, we'll dive into that later when we talk about linear and angular kinematics and kinetics. But I just wanted to give you guys a taste of that now so you kind of understand what we're talking about, what we're dealing with here. Now when we look at strain, we're talking about a pulling apart. Okay, it's a change from resting length to its new length. Okay, so whatever it started as, it's pulled apart and then pulled back together if it's elastic, not elastic, if it's plastic, if it's failure, things like that. But in general, lengthening starting position, ending position, that's how that is. That's represented as epsilon in an equation, and that will be a change in length divided by the starting length, and that's how you find out length. So when we're looking at a structural analysis, we're looking at the elastic modulus typically, just kind of figuring out, okay, how much bend and how much force can we put through this structure before it actually starts to fail on us. So it gives us the overall the stiffness of an object. Now what we want to look at is in this first left, let me see, okay, there we go, my mouse does show up. So in this area here, this is the sweet spot for us. This is what we want, where it can handle some stress, it can handle some strain, so it can handle some squeezing, some pulling. But at this point right here, where this first dotted line is, that's what we call the yield point. And what that yield point is where we start to get some damage within that structure. So if you think of it as a tree, I'm sure all of us have grabbed a tree branch at some point and we've bent that tree branch. If you bend it slow, what happens is you start to hear a little bit of crack. Now visually that tree branch, if it's a green alive branch, it's fine. No structural damage has occurred that you can see, but you've heard it as the fibers within the tree have started to break. I had a popsicle, but when I tried doing my live recording, it broke. And so here I am with nothing. So I'm using the tree example, and I hope you guys understand it. Now if we keep bending that stick after it starts cracking, then what happens is we get a failure point, and that's when the branch is completely broken in half and we're left with two pieces of stick, or a stick that's just hanging in the shape of a V or a upside down U. And that is what we call the failure point. Now when we're talking about bone, it handles these stresses and strains every day with every movement that we do. But what happens is we cause all these micro traumas, and now when we cause these micro traumas, that's when we're hitting this plastic point, which is past the yield point, and that's where it stops going back to its original form. Now our body usually handles these without any issues, but if we keep loading that, ultimately we'll hit the failure point, which would lead to a fracture, which would lead to a stress strain reducing to zero, because now there is no stress strain because it is completely broken, it has failed. So bone. Bone is 20% of our total body weight. Its job is to support the weight of the body, to provide attachment sites, to create levers within the body, to protect organs, and blood cell formation. Now we'll dive into the leverage a little bit later when we dive into the muscles, and we'll understand that a little bit better. But it also stores fat and minerals. Fat is in the bone marrow, and the minerals are stored within the bone, and those minerals are calcium and phosphate. And then you also have hematopoiesis, which is blood cell formation and storage. So as I said before, support and attachment sites. Bones increase in size as you move inferiorly from the head. As weight and responsibility increases, bone size increases. So those two are very proportionate to each other. And then it also provides attachment sites for tendons, muscles, ligaments, and those help transfer the force from soft tissue to the bone. So that really dives into our levers. So let's look here. So if we look here anatomically, right, let's look at our arm and our leg, okay? So anatomically, they're very similar if we look. Look at the back of this elbow here. It goes a little bit further. You have a bony stop here where we don't have a bony stop here. But other than that, we have very similar structures here. So we look here, we look at the shoulder, right? So it's a little bit more shallow in this humerus, but then it comes down to these epicondyles, lateral and medial, right? And it provides attachment sites for your muscles. Then we have here, it's a little deeper, a little bit more pronounced head versus this head here that's a little bit more shallow. But otherwise, they look very similar, right? That shaft of the humerus and the shaft of the femur, they look about the same, right? And then you look at these medial and lateral epicondyles down here. They're very similar in structure of the knee and of the elbow, right? Like I said, except for that bony protuberance here. Very similar. Very, very similar. Okay? And then, if you want to look even down here at these carpal bones here, and then our metatarsals down here, right there, metatarsals, our carpal bones, our talus, our calcaneus, which is a larger one, talus in here, navicular, right? So they're all very similar, right? And then you look at our toes, they're just like giant fingers, really, right? Same. Metacarpals, metatarsals down there, phalanges and phalanges. They all look very similar. So you see though, the ones that have to support our weight are much larger. If our legs were, or if our arms had to support our weight, like if we were a quadruped animal crawling, right? These arms may be a little bit longer. You look at your dog and or your cat, and you'll see that the back legs are a little bit larger because they have a little bit more muscle mass, but height-wise, they're about the same, right? Because they're walking on them all the time. So the musculature is larger, but the bones are about the same size. Not the case for us. And then if you look at here, our ribs and our pelvis, right? Our ribs are going to protect our internal organs, our lungs, our heart, our spleen, our liver, that sit down here. They're going to sit and hold our bowels down here, our stomach, our reproductive organs. It holds all those in there. So you see how these are really designed to just protect and encapsulate all of our vital organs. And then if you even come up here, right, we have our head. And if you look inside here, right, let's go sideways because it's just a little bit easier. If you look at our head and we go inside, and you see it's just a hollow shell. Oh, there we go. It's a little bit better, but you can see how it's just hollow inside here. So we're just moving around our skull, and you see it's just hollow. The whole function of this is just to focus on protecting our brain, right? Just sits here filled with fluid, and it provides an encapsulation, almost like a snow globe, right? So you can see the different functions of bone, and then you can even look here at our scapula, and that is designed mostly, it's very irregular in its shape, right? And it's designed, if you put your right arm over your left shoulder, you'll feel the bony part right there, and that's this spine of the scapula, but the rest of it's hidden. It's underneath your back, right? It's underneath all this musculature. So you see how it really provides a lot of attachment sites for muscles here. Okay? So let's go back to the PowerPoint. So the composition of bone. It's formerly known as an osseous tissue. It's light with high tensile, elastic, and compressive strength. 5 to 7% of the bone mass is recycled each week. So that means about 5 to 7% of that bone is brand new bone. Okay? About a half gram of calcium moves in and out of the bone each day. That's why calcium is very important within our diet, because if our body doesn't have that to replenish, then we start to become a little bit deficient. And now we start running into some of these issues that we run into with stress fractures and osteoporosis, things like that, because of that bone mineral not being replaced. And it's continually modified, reshaped, remodeled, and overhauled, because as we change our bodies, it's going to completely adapt. Our bodies are very, very adaptive, and that's its job, is to just adapt and change. So if we're changing 5 to 7% of our bone mass each week, it takes a little bit, about a month, but we can change how our bones are shaped by changing what we ask our bodies to do. And then calcium, phosphate, and collagen fibers make up about 60 to 70% of bone. Once again, really diving into, if we are deficient in these minerals, what's going to happen to our bodies? If we're deficient in calcium, deficient in phosphate, deficient in the proteins that make up collagen fibers, what happens? We're going to have some weaker, less dense bones. And then water makes up about 25 to 30% of our bone weight as well. So inside that bone marrow, I don't know if you guys have ever fine dined. I haven't, because it just doesn't sound appealing. But people say it's delicious. But eating like the bone marrow of cows, I know that in cooking stocks we use bones a lot, because all that fat and water comes out of the bone, right? So if we think of that there, if we're dehydrated, what does that do to our bone as well? It helps make us deficient and decreases the effectiveness of bone to respond to the forces that we are placing upon it. Collagen is focused on tensile strength and flexibility, and then the minerals give bone its compressive strength and rigidity. Okay, so that's how there's a delicate balance between these two forces within a piece of bone. So then we have bone cells. What kind of bone cells do we have? We have osteoblasts, which help calcify new bone growth. Then we have osteoclasts that dissolve bone in areas of a microfracture. Okay, so these two are they're balanced between each other, right? One breaks down, one adds. Now, osteoclastic activity is typically a little bit faster than osteoblastic activity. That's why our adapting our loads as we're training individuals, especially if we're starting weight training, right? So as we said, our bones are the shape they are because of muscle attachments on the bones, because of the forces that we're asking it to do. So if we go too fast and load too much and create too much force on there, then we're not going to be able, our bones won't be able to adapt, and our muscles adapt much faster than our bones do. But so if we don't take that into account, that's how you get these ruptures of avulsion fractures and ruptures of muscles and tendons and just snapping off, or why you hear weight training might not be good for your younger individuals. Okay, that's where all this starts to come into play. It's not correct science, but that's where these theories start to play a factor. You also have osteocytes. What are osteocytes? Osteocytes are osteoblasts that remain in the new bone. So as these osteoblasts are calcifying in this new bone growth, what will happen is some of these osteoblasts will remain, which turn into osteocytes. You almost think of them as like finger-like cells within there that kind of talk to each other. And they become mechanoreceptors, and they talk to each other to direct new osteoclastic activity, so that those osteocytes, that what were osteoblasts that are now osteocytes, as they were laying new bone, they remain, so that they're like, hey, you know what? I'm not feeling as much stress and strain as we thought we were going to have, but over there, we need more. So go ahead and start putting a little bit more osteoclastic activity over there. Start breaking that down so that we can put new osteoblasts down. That's how that kind of works. So then once they build this bone, what kind of bone are they going to build? So we have this cortical bone that's 80% of our skeleton. It looks solid, but it's filled with web-like collagen called lamellae. Lamellae. I call it lamellae. These lamellae create Haversian systems, which are like pillars that run in the direction of the applied stress. It's typically arranged in layers, so it's like a web-like layer type thing. And then the outer wall is non-porous and dense. So if you think of like a chicken bone, if you ever had that, right? The outer layer is smooth, it's not very porous, and it's dense, it's thicker, right? It can withstand substantial loads longitudinally before the failure. Now, when you say longitudinally, because it's in the plane of the bone formation, so the bone growth, so it can handle that up and down force. And then it's efficient at absorbing tensile stress and parallel to these Haversian systems. So as long as it's parallel with these forces here, you can see how this compact bone and the trabeculae of the spongy bone and the spongy bone here all are around. It starts filling these up, and you can kind of see how these move in different directions. So this little section here that kind of looks like a V, this bone's going to be great at handling forces within this area, and this is going to be good at handling forces in this plane here. Okay, typically you can think that this is a thick cortical bone in the middle of the bones, and it's thin on the ends. The thin ends allows for a better absorption of the force, so the ends of these bones are a little bit more hollow to create a little bit more sponge and bounce within the bones. So if you land on your knees, if it was so stiff, you chip this bone every time you hit it, right? As these two bones come colliding into each other. So they make it a little bit more spongy at the end so that it can handle that. Whereas in the middle, in the shaft, if you think of a popsicle stick, let me see if I got something over here that I can use as an example. I don't, but I have this little card here, right? So you see this card. Let me try and find a good light here. There, right? So if I load it, right, what happens? If I load it, it's going to bend where? Right in the middle, right? So as let's say I'm landing from a jump, and this is my lower leg. I land, this bump force comes in here. So where do I need to add more strength? Right? In the middle, because it's bending. So I add more strength, and now it can handle these forces. Now it wants to go the other way. So then if I do it this way, eventually now it's stronger, because now it's being held in place laterally and parallel within that force. Not parallel, perpendicular to that force. So it's a little bit stronger. So that's why the middle of those bones are typically stronger. than the ends, which are a little bit more hollow. Okay. Then you have this cancellous bone, which is found at the end of long bones, vertebral bodies, and scapula and pelvis. It's a lattice-like structural arrangement. It's not very dense. It's filled with beams of trabeculae that provide strength and congruence with the collagen. It's excellent at absorbing stress. So you think of like our hips, our vertebral bodies, these long bones in our femurs and things like that. That's where these are coming into play. And like I said, almost the same as those Haversian systems, where it's really good at absorbing force within the plane of its webbing. Metabolically, it's very active and it rebuilds at a faster rate than the cortical bone. And then it's a high incidence of fracture in older individuals because of that mineral loss. Okay. I actually want to add here that it's a high incidence of fracture in older individuals with mineral loss, and then and younger individuals, there's actually growth plates underneath them typically. That at the top, it's a very softer piece of bone that can be fractured as well. Okay, so long bones. So when we're looking at long bones, we're looking at the clavicle, the humerus, the radius, the ulnar, the femur, the tibia, the fibula, the metatarsal, metacarpal phalanges. Right? So we're looking at these, right? Long bones. Look at these long, straight bones. They all have kind of the same characteristic, right? A bigger end, and then a narrower, more solid, dense shaft. We look down here. Look at our hands down here, our metacarpals. All right, same, longer end or wider end, narrow shaft, wider end. Same all the way down in those fingers, right? We're looking here at the femur, same. Wide, narrow, wide. Down here, wide, narrow, wide. Wide, narrow, wide. Wide, narrow, wide. Okay? There's 4 parts within these bones. It's called the diaphysis, okay, which is here, this middle piece. The shaft, it contains the thick cortical bone around bone marrow. The metaphysis, sorry, is the shaft widening near the end of the bone. So you got a little bit here, and you got a little bit down here. So right where it starts to widen up. You have the epiphysis, which is the growth plate, and oh no, let me see if I can do this here. All right, cool, that works. Yeah, so you can see that here, right? See these little lines? This is a femur here, what this is. And you see that near the head. So it's softer, and this is often in younger individuals where that bone's going to grow, and if you fracture through that, it can disrupt that and calcify that a little too soon, so then it doesn't remain open, and then you actually start to get a little bit of deficiency and they start to not grow how they're supposed to. Then you have the periosteum, which is a thin membrane covering the outside of the bone. So it's not pictured on here, but you could almost imagine it as like a saran wrap that sits around the bone. The long bone is the strongest when stressed in the long axis of the bone. So when it's loaded top to bottom, okay? That's what that means. Then you have short, flat, and irregular bones. Short bones are our carpals, our sesamoid, and our tarsals. It's a cancellous bone covered with thin cortical bone, and it's excellent at shock absorption. So if we look at where those bones are, right? So we said they're in our carpals, our sesamoid, and our tarsals. Look at these guys here, right? What are these little guys' function? To be highly mobile, and if you fall, what do? You usually put your hand out, right? So instinctually, these guys have to be able to compact and absorb a shock without getting hurt. Okay? And if you look down here, there it is. And we look at our tarsal bones down here, right? Same idea, right? Look how loose these are. Very small bones, so that we can just walk every day and they can move and handle the weight, handle uneven terrain, adapt to all the possibilities that we have to, all the forces that they have to adapt to. And it allows them to compact down, in, out, invert, evert, plantar flex, dorsiflex. So it's really kind of amazing at everything we ask it to do and how it does it so well. Our flat bones are our ribs, our ilium, our sternum, and our scapula. Oops, sorry. Flat bones. So here we go. Our ilium here. Right? Nice little. It's thicker, but it's relatively flat, right? If you look at it, the inside and the outside, it's pretty flat. Look at our ribs. Look how flat those ribs are. Let me move up. Sorry. Look how flat those are. Very flat. A scapula, look at that. Made just for protecting, right? 2 layers of cortical bone with cancellous bone between it. And it's organ protection and it's broad muscle attachment. Think of that pelvis. When we add muscles to this, right? The only parts of this that you're actually feeling, if you were to put your hands on your hips, you're only feeling this top ridge. The rest of that is buried in thick, beefy muscle pieces that provide broad attachments. Okay, so that's what that function is. Then we have our regular bones, our skull, our pelvis, and our vertebrae. Okay, so yeah, I named the ilium, but then the rest of it is our regular bones. So we're talking about like our ischium down here. That's this little curvy guy right here. Our sacrum. Look at our sacrum right here, this triangle. Our vertebrae down here. Our skull, irregular, very irregular. Right? So those are our irregular bones. And it's specialized in its shape and function. So when we sit and we actually start looking at bone formation and how it's provided and how it adapts to everything we ask about it or ask of it, it's highly adaptive. Okay, there's a law called Wolff's law. What it means in layman's term is that bone adapts to the forces applied upon it. So if we go back, right, we say here that 5 to 7% of our bone mass is recycled each week, and that half a gram moves in and out each day, and then it's continually modified, reshaped, remodeled, and overhauled, right? So what happens is this. Our body understands what we're asking it to do. So let's say I'm living a sedentary lifestyle right now. If I started taking on weightlifting, football, rugby, things like that, my body's going to understand that I'm starting to ask more of it. I'm starting to load, if I'm doing weightlifting, load that bone more, and thus it needs to add more bone mass to those bones. And that's where this osteoblastic, osteoclastic activity really starts revving up, and you need to taper it. Otherwise, you get too much osteoclastic before you get osteoblastic, and then you start getting an injury, stress fractures, and things like that. What happens is you get this ossification where bone is always formed by replacement of existing tissue. Okay, so let's say like in our fetus, hyaline cartilage is replaced with bone. So a fetus needs to be very flexible. So if I give it a very rigid structure, it's going to have a lot of trouble coming through that birth canal and not being flexible. That's why they have to, shape the head, because that is very flexible. It's not actual calcified bone yet. It's very soft as it starts to harden up over. And a baby's bones are very soft, so that because at this point in the game it needed to be able to flex and move and not be so rigid to get through that birth canal. By the time of birth though, most bones have at least partially ossified. So some of those long bones in the middle, those are a little bit ossified, but the ends may be a little bit more flexible still. And then the skull is not cartilage in an infant, it's actually a fibrous tissue, so it's more like a ligament. Okay? And then long bones continue to grow through adolescence, and that's where those epiphyseal plates between the shaft and the head of the bone expands and continues to ossify until about 25 years old. So a lot of you guys are still possibly growing. Okay? That's how, if you see, don't want to jump in here. Let's jump in after here. Modeling. So this occurs during growth to help adapt to the tensile and compressive forces that are being asked of bone. During this process, osteoclasts absorb old bone while osteoblasts add the new bone. The removal of bone by osteoclasts is called resorption, and then osteoclastic activity is much faster than that osteoblastic activity which I mentioned earlier, until the growing phase of life ceases. Okay, so until about that 25-year-old, once those growth plates close, that's when it kind of rebalances out. This process reverses and has greater osteoblastic activity when greater stress is placed on the bone or when an injury occurs. Okay, because now we got those osteocytes that kind of understand what's happening and help gauge where to lay those osteoblasts. At 40, osteoblastic activity slows even more, leading to a gradual loss in bone density. So this is where I was going to think about saying in the last slide here, that the epiphyseal plates in the shaft of the head of the bone expands and continues to ossify until age 25. So when you have athletes, you may find that when they get to college, you're like, I grew 3 inches. What happened, right? Maybe you started getting on a weight training program where you're loading the bones a little bit more, and now you're asking these bones to grow because you need to ask more of them, right? So that's where this modeling and remodeling happens, and you start increasing your bone mineral density, increasing the osteocytes response to the stress you're placing upon it, and thus increasing growth because you need more bone growth because it needs to be denser, it needs to be thicker, and you need more of it because of the forces you're placing upon it. Okay? So changes in bones across the lifespan. In young bones, the fibers are randomly aligned. Fresh new bones, they're not being asked to deal with any stress at that point, right? As a young kid, I'm not even walking, I'm not even crawling yet, I'm just lying there. So the fibers are randomly aligned. Then, as humans mature and as I start crawling, now my femur becomes a little bit more dense. My hands and my wrists and my ulna and radius and my humerus start feeling a little bit more. I might have to start holding my head up as a baby, so my vertebrae, my skull start to get a little bit more thick because my muscles are growing and they're pulling on those bones a little bit more, so they need to be a little bit stronger at the attachment sites. They also need to be a little bit more stiff to support my weight, right? And then as we age, past 40-year mark, the Haversian system becomes less dense, creating greater space between the fibers and thus leading to a reduction in the overall strength. So as we start losing that bone mineral density, the Haversian system kind of becomes less dense and it's not as thick of a webbing. You have bigger gaps, so it starts to look more like a focaccia bread, a very aerated type bread versus a very dense like pound cake that we could think of. Okay, due to a decreased osteoblastic activity is why this happens, and some evidence suggests that decreased activity assists with this decrease in osteoblastic activity. So what that means is typically as we get older, as we get past 40 years old, I'm not going out and playing pickup basketball anymore. I'm not lifting weights as much. I'm living more of a sedentary lifestyle, which then says that my body doesn't need to really fight off anything other than gravity and getting up and getting down and getting out of bed in the morning. So when that happens, my osteoblastic activity is going to decrease because I'm not asking much of it. I'm not asking it to repair too much because the body isn't receiving these micro traumas as it was when I was younger. And that's why you start seeing this reduction here. And you can see here in this figure 216 from the Hamill book, you see the peak bone mass occurs during late third decade of life, and females have a lower peak bone mass and greater reductions later in life, especially after menopause, and that's more of that hormonal change there. And you can see these changes here. You can see how it's a little bit steeper for the women versus the men. So the role of physical activity in bone health, as we just talked about, how as we age and we decrease physical activity, which can lead to a decrease in osteoblastic activity. Physical activity is pretty important, right? Bones require these mechanical stresses to grow and to stay strong and to maintain bone density. Thus, physical activity is important. And these muscle contractions and external forces that are exerted are the largest provider of these stressors. Thus, overloading must be applied to bone to stimulate growth. So, as I was talking about earlier, how you can still grow in college, the epiphyseal plates don't close until about age 25. So, what happens is, um, typically, you go from high school, like I'm using a college athlete as an example, but you go from high school where you have a kind of thrown together strength program to a very sophisticated and focused strength training plan, and thus you start to use the overloading principle to help stimulate this bone growth, and then Wolff's law takes into effect, right? Bone adapts to the forces applied upon it, and thus the bone starts to grow, and that's how you actually get people growing in college later in life, that kind of second growth spurt that you sometimes see. Okay, dynamic, when we're doing an overload strength program in terms of increasing bone mineral density, dynamic loading is better than static loading. So if it's a dynamic, quick, fast force, it's much better than just adding weight, adding weight, adding weight. Like if you think about it here, if I do a quick bend like that, it can handle that, right? My pen can, no problem. But if I was just to hold it, I'll start hearing some cracks and it's not as strong. Bone isn't as strong. Okay, higher frequency is better than a lower frequency. Okay, and then shorter versus longer duration. So if I do a quick and just kind of keep hitting it like that, that's better versus a long duration. So if I have a long workout, I don't want that. I don't want low frequency, and I don't want static loads. Okay. So like if you're a cross country runner and you're like, I need to get X amount of miles, break those miles from longer runs, break those into shorter runs with smaller sessions per day, so that you're getting the same mileage, but you're just not getting it as long. If we're talking about it in terms of bone health, okay, bone health specifically. So what's happening is if you're getting stress fractures, right, this isn't working for you. You're doing either a static loading, you're doing too low frequency and too long of a run. You're too much too soon for your body. Okay, everyone's body is different. The lower the age equals the greater bone response to the stimulus. Okay, so you can adapt a little bit better, and then you maximize that bone mineral density in the first 3 decades of life. So 30 years old. So I'm 34, going on 35. So I'm past that. So I gotta start working out. Otherwise, my bone mineral density is gonna go. I got 1 year left. Right. Well, a couple months. Okay, and it decreases by 0.5% after year 40. So just keep that in mind if you are training somebody or working with patients, like their bone mineral density is decreasing after year 40 by 0.5%. So how do you combat that? Right here, okay? Inactivity, bone mass is reabsorbed after inactivity, such as bed rest or immobilization. So I take away all the forces, I take away the muscle contractions, I take away having to deal with gravitational pulls pulling on my bones and muscles. Thus, bone mass is going to just be resorbed into the bloodstream. And osteoporosis is bone resorption is greater than the bone deposits typically. It's typically in postmenopausal women. Your risk is 50% greater at that point. Genetics, hormones, nutrition, lack of exercise is believed to contribute to this. And estrogen levels in anorexic and amenorrheic females has been linked to osteoporosis. So eating disorder with anorexia and amenorrheic, so a lack of a period, a lack of menstruation, is what can also cause some osteoporosis a little bit earlier. So mechanical properties of bones. Okay, so mechanical properties are dynamic with age and activity level. Not all bones are created equal, and some properties change on the bone's demands. So the strength, the amount of load material can withstand before failure. The failure is caused by a single traumatic event or microtraumas, repetitive microtraumas. The strength of bone and mineral density is in the mineral density. So the more dense the minerals, the stronger the bone. So mineralization is greater, or the greater the mineralization equals greater strength. Okay, so more minerals, more density, more strength. At some point, though, you get too much mineralization and the bone becomes brittle. That's why there's this fine balance, and you'll see on this chart to our left here that it kind of demonstrates that. In cortical bone, the compressive strength is greater than concrete, wood, and glass. The cortical bone is stronger than cancellous bone, and cancellous can tolerate greater deformation. Okay, so if we're looking here at our fixture on the left, right? So bone falls here by strength and weakness down here, strength and flexibility. So it's got this little thing. So it's kind of strong, kind of flexible, right? You look at copper, right? Copper is a very soft metal, it's known as. So it's a little more stiff and it's a little bit more weak. So it's easy to bend and easy to move, right? But it will hold its shape if thick enough, right? So that's how that goes. Gold is also a very soft metal, they say. So it's a little bit weaker metal. So I wouldn't build a house out of gold because it's a little bit more flexible. Then you look over here, you look at fiberglass. It's a little bit more flexible and it's very strong. Okay. You look at steel. It's very stiff and strong. Steel is not known for bending, right? Well, bone, we need it to. And that's why it's where it is. And it's a little, not as strong, but it's still very flexible. And you see here oak, lead, glass, a little bit more strong. So the mechanical properties of bone still. So now when we talk about stiffness, when we're talking about stiffness, we're talking about material's resistance to the load as it deforms or bends. So bone deforms no more than approximately 3%. Okay, so that's what we call that elastic region. If you remember back to our original slide, the elastic region is how much something can bend before it fails. It starts to yield and then fail. So that's the elastic region where it goes back to its original shape. After 3%, we start to get failure. Okay, the bone is in the plastic region, meaning fibers begin to deform and create a microtrauma until it ultimately fails. So that's that plastic region after 3%. Bone is better at handling high, fast stress versus long, lower duration stress. It's anisotropic, which means that bone has different strength depending on the type of force applied. And it's also viscoelastic, which means its response to those forces depends on the rate and duration of that load, which pretty much just says everything I said earlier about, you know, you want shorter load or shorter durations, higher, faster loads, type things like that. So what kind of stress does bone have to deal with? Well, we have normal stress, which is just when forces are applied perpendicular to the cross section, and it causes a change in length in bone. So it compacts the bone, right? And it pulls on the bone, depending on how it is. Pulling, tension, and compression. Okay. Then we have the shear force. Okay, right there. And that's the load is parallel with the cross section, and it causes a change in the angle. This is where you get like your spondylolistheses and your tibial plateau fractures in this, because you get this shearing where it rubs like that. Boom. So we're thinking here, boom, boom, like that. Pulling in the even with the cross section. Okay, so it shows here in this photo here, it's pulling across here. It's shearing, it's rubbing. Spondylolisthesis is where the vertebrae slips forward because of the stresses placed upon it. And then tibial plateau fractures, if you were to run, stop real hard. A lot of times if you tear an ACL where it's a planted lower portion of your leg and then a twist, you'll get this twist which grinds along that transverse plane that we just learned about, and it causes that tibial plateau fracture. You have a compression fracture, excuse me, where both ends of the bone are approximated. So it's pushed down, boom, like that. So this is a compression, squeeze, boom, like that. Both ends of the bone are approximated, and it's necessary for healthy bone growth and development, and most bones are susceptible to these forces. So a compression load is okay, it's just when we get too high of a compression load. So go back to what we were talking about earlier, where we talk about this right here. This is our key. When we break that, we have a long duration, static load. It can't handle this compression force, and you start to get some of these compression type fractures. Then you get a tensile load. This is most associated with the pulling of muscles and tendons. Bone will align with the tension. So we were talking about those Haversian systems and those fibers within the bone. If it's pulling on it, what happens is the bone starts growing that way. Failure often occurs at the tendon insertion, which causes what we call a avulsion fracture. And it's more frequent in children than adults because those growth plates and those connective areas are not fully calcified. And then it's often common in the knee, the medial elbow, Tommy John type things like that, and the fifth metatarsal and calcaneus. So calcaneus, where I'll show you here, right? So we have our medial epicondyle. So what do we notice about our medial epicondyle right here, right? It has a protuberance, right? And why is that? Because we have the flexors of our hand that pull on that. So if those fibers are pulling in this area, those fibers are going to be aligned this way, and the bone adapted to that force by growing out. Okay. Then I said what? Down in the knee. So what in the knee could cause that? Well, let's look right here. You have your patella, and what attaches to your patella? That's correct, everyone. Your quadricep muscles. Your quadricep muscles run into your quadricep tendon, which attaches here, and then it has this sesamoid bone, which is your patella in the middle, and then it continues with that tendon into your patellar tendon, and it attaches right here on this tuberosity. And you see how the bone has started to project out. Some of you guys may have a more prominent tuberosity, and that's because at a younger age you started doing activity at too high of a level that created too much force and started pulling on that bone too much, which caused that to grow out a little bit further than it normally would. Then in our calcaneus that might happen, right? We said what happens, what bones back here, or what muscles attaches back here, right? Our Achilles runs back here and causes that pull, as it can pull on here, and you see how the bone is a little bit different back there, right? It's got that protuberance as well. It comes down, and then a big ball at the end right there, so it attaches. And then that fifth metatarsal we said, right? So let's look how that guy looks. I can't get a great photo of it, sorry. There we go. Right here. So you see this little protuberance here? This is where peroneals come through, and they attach on the outside of our foot to help keep our ankles from rolling in when we're doing activity. Okay? So you can kind of see how that changes and how our bones have adapted to handle these tensile forces. Bending in bones, regular force that bending in bones is a regular force that bone must adapt to, right? Because we get those compressions and bending there. Bone is strongest in the area of the greatest bend. So when bone fails, it's often on the convex side. Bone is better at handling compression versus tension, okay? We have what they call a three-point force when it does break. It's a compression and tension occurs at the bone along with a perpendicular force. So the break occurs at the middle point. So if I were to, you have to think of it this way. Three-point force, when we use this card again, there. 1 point, 2 point, and then I add a third right here. So let's say it's a shoe or a football player coming and tackling me and hitting me there. What's it going to do? It's going to just bend, sorry, I'm trying to get it going, that way, right? And boom, it's going to break. And it often fails on the convex side, right? Concave, convex. It's going to fail on this end. So let's look at that in actual life here. Let's look at that in our model. Okay? So bone, as I said earlier, it has to deal with that. So what bone out here has to deal with the most weight? the most compressive bending force is probably our femur. Look how it's shaped. It's a little bit bowed, right? So we have a concave side over here and a convex side over on this side. So if this was to most likely fail, what side would it be on? It'd be on this convex side over here because it's already being bent that way, right? So it's already going to be weaker on this side because it's already under a little bit of a tension on this side because it is convex. Whereas over here it's a concave side, so it's being compressed, and we know bone is better at handling these compressive forces. So if it's going to break, it's going to be here. So then if I cause a 3-point force, if I'm just standing, I'm applying force this way from gravity. Then I have a ground reaction force coming up this way, right, as the bones, this tibial plateau is pushing here. So then if someone comes and hits me here, right through the middle, that would be our 3-point break. And then our 4-point break is 2 equal opposite forces at each end of the bone, and the break occurs at the weakest point, which is often down at the bottom down there. So this figure 232 is our 4-point force. Oops, I never took that off. My bad. It's not 215. That's wrong. Stress on bones. Stress fractures. So repeated low magnitude load over a prolonged time. So we go back to what I said, right? We want short time, all right, and a high load. Boom, boom, boom. Our bones can handle those. So when you load it up with a low magnitude, long duration, this is where we start getting stress fractures. It's a micro trauma that's repeated at a rate in which the bone cannot repair itself. The bone resorption weakens the bone before the bone deposits can occur. So the osteoclastic activity is resorbing the bone faster than the osteoblastic activity can lay more bone down. Muscle fatigue plays a role in this. Okay, 10% of our athletes have these types of injuries, and posture and soft tissue may also play a role in this. So why does muscle fatigue play a role? If we look at our foot again, right? Just because we know a lot of people get stress fractures in their feet, gymnasts actually get them in their wrists and their ulna and radius up here. So what happens is down here, right? Look at the shape of our foot. It's an arch, right? So it's like a spring. If anyone's works on cars, you know that our cars have leaf springs, which are these bowed, concave and convex type materials that help dissipate load. But if our feet start getting tired, the muscles on the bottom of your feet, you don't feel the bones right on the bottom of your feet except for the sesamoid bone under your large toe here. The rest of it's pretty meaty tissue, right? Now if those muscles get tired and they can't do their job and hold this arch anymore, then all that force as we're running and creating this load has to be absorbed somewhere, and it's going to be absorbed in these bones. And that's where you start getting these stress fractures in these metatarsals down here, or you start getting them in your shins because even your feet can't handle it, and then the force just continues to travel up into your body. So then how our body helps to try and dissipate some of that load is through cartilage. We have articular cartilage and then more of a fibrocartilage. Articular cartilage is often where two bones meet, and we call that a hyaline cartilage. 60 to 80% water. That's why being hydrated as an athlete is very important, or even if you're physically active, or if you just have arthritis, right? You want to make sure you're taking a lot of water because 60 to 80% of your hyaline cartilage is water. And then it's also collagen and protoglycan. Okay, collagen creates a stiffness within that cartilage, and then the protoglycan glycan is like a hydrated gel. Okay, it has no blood, so articular cartilage has no blood supply and no nerves. So what does that mean? If it has no nerves, I can't feel it when it's injured. Okay, but we do feel it at its attachments. That's how something like a meniscus tear will cause pain. It has no blood. So what else does that mean? No blood, no healing. Okay, so when it's injured, it heals very, very poorly because there is no blood supply there. It's only nourished by the synovial fluid, which is also mostly water. So if you don't have this water and this synovial fluid in here, then that's what happens is you start to have some of this breakdown within there. It resists shear forces very well and it reduces contact load by 50%. It's almost a frictionless material. So the friction coefficient of ice, if you think of ice, walking on ice, it's very difficult, right? It's 0.1. For hyaline cartilage, it's 0.01. Okay, so it's even less to 0.04. So it's so frictionless, so smooth. We say it's like glass because that's the best thing that we can think of, but it's actually slicker than glass. Okay, then we also have fibrocartilage, which are like our intervertebral discs and our meniscus. These are great at resisting high pressure. So that's why in our knee, somewhere where we run and jump, it has to absorb a lot of things. So that's why it has that articular hyaline cartilage in here. And then we also have those menisci that help absorb it. So soft, adds a little bit of stiffness, reduces friction on this articular cartilage within that knee. Then you have the meniscus that's kind of this white space in here. It's not actually depicted, but it sits right within this white gap. And that meniscus adds just a high pressure and a pressing, so it adds just a little bit more shock absorption within that joint. You also have ligaments. Okay, ligaments are a type of fibrous connective tissue that connects bone to bone. It blends in with the capsule of the joint often, and a capsule within a joint is most like if you just imagined connecting two pieces together and just taped the heck out of them. That would be like a capsule. It becomes stronger and stiffer over time. Okay, it's best suited for tensile loading, and ligament strength diminishes rapidly with immobilization. That's why we don't really immobilize anymore. So let's say you got an ACL repair, we want to get you up and walking pretty quickly, because what happens is that ligament strength is going to start diminishing, and we actually want to strengthen that ligament because we took it from a part of the body that is used to handling some load, but it's often not the same amount of load as like an ACL would handle. So we want to make sure that that stays strong and is getting thicker over time. Ligament damage causes joint instability often. So we look back here, this is our knee, these are like our MCL here, our LCL over here, and these are kind of add lateral support to the knee, lateral and medial support to the knee. And what happens is if we tear one, we lose that stability within there because our knee is actually wrapped in a capsule as well. And you also see that it becomes stronger and stiffer over time. So that's why when you do jump training and on an ACL patient or someone who had a ligament reconstruction within somewhere, right, it gets thicker and stronger over time. So you want to progressively load that tissue like you would a bone and treat it just like that, because it has to adapt and has to get stronger, has to get stiffer. You can't just go out and do what you want to do after you replaced it. So then we have joint surface shape. So we're dealing with convex and concave joints, articulations most of the time. Most of the joints in the body work this way. It's a convex concave rule. So that means that a concave surface will glide on a fixed convex surface in the same direction as the distal moving end. Okay? Think about your finger. In extension, the concave surface will glide posteriorly as the finger extends, vice versa. And then the convex glides in the opposite direction with the end of the bony segment. So think of this as this way, a fist with a cupped hand. You can see it here on these two pictures here, okay? But this is the easiest way to talk about it, okay? Convex and concave. So my fist is convex, there we go, and my hand is concave, right? It's easier if I go this way, right? There we go, okay? So if I move this way, right, where does my elbow go? Right? The same. So this is a concave on convex rotation. So if I move to the left, my elbow also moves to the left, right? And then if I move to the right, it goes there too. But if I reverse it, and now I take this bottom part, right? If I'm referencing the bottom part, so the convex surface, and I move the convex surface, if it moves to the right, where does the elbow go there? It moves to the left, okay? Does that make sense? So let me just switch it here so you can see a little bit better. All right, so if I move this way with this, right? where does my elbow go? So as this convex portion of my fist, if it moves this way, my elbow moves the other way. Okay? So when it's convex on concave, opposite. Concave on convex, same. That's what that means. Very important in understanding how the body moves, and it's also important to understand which piece is moving on which so that you can understand and articulate how that's moving. Joint congruency. When a joint is congruent, the joint surfaces have maximum contact with each other. Ligaments in the capsule are taut and they make the joint difficult to separate. Usually this is at the very end range of motion, and we call this a closed packed position. So the joint surfaces have maximum contact. So that's this here. You see, this is the knee, and you see that it's all that blue. That's the amount of contact on bone. Very strong, a lot of contact. The ligaments are tight, closed packed position. Now when the joint surface is in the most incongruent position, we call that loose packed position. The capsule and ligaments are lax, so there's no tension from the capsule and ligaments, and then there's passive separation of the joint can occur because very little, has no stability because there's no ligaments holding it. There's very little bone-on-bone contact, so it's very unstable at this point. And this is how what we call joint play, and this is where those joints start moving a little bit. And if we're doing special tests and moving around, and it's smart to understand what these are because of the fact that if you're asking someone to exercise and load a joint within this loose pack position, you're going to probably injure them, and that's not what we would like. So that is all that I have now. I hope that this makes sense, and I will see you guys in the lab on Wednesday and Thursday. If you have some scissors, bring them. We're not going to do much physical activity, so we will be in the OT lab, which is I think in Dorothy Day, and we're going to be down there. I'm trying to think, or is it Mama T? I'll put it in the announcements. I'll find out for sure which one it is. But we'll be in there, and we're going to start doing our cardboard man. So we're going to learn about bone and stresses and forces applied upon it by creating a cardboard man with our partners and ask it to hold a 10-pound weight. So that'll be kind of fun. Nice, easy way for us to learn about bone and muscle and ligaments and joints and things like that as we try to support them. Okay? Sorry that I couldn't be on live. Sorry that this took a little longer to get up than I had planned. Yeah, I will see you guys in class. Take care. Have a safe Labor Day. And, oh, there's little Henry right there. That's my son. And, yeah, take care, guys. Bye.